Venezuela just made a catastrophic miscalculation, and the US is about to make it worse. Let me take you back to July 11, 2024, a day that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine patrol in the Caribbean. The USS Harry S. Truman, one of the U.S. Navy's most advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, was conducting what the Pentagon called freedom of navigation operations near Venezuela's coast. Then, out of nowhere, a Venezuelan Su-30 flanker, one of the few modern fighter jets Nicolas Maduro's regime still has operational, locked onto a US P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft with its fire control radar. Not once, but twice. The U.S. Southern Command called it unsafe and unprofessional. The Venezuelan Defense Ministry called it a routine intercept. The media barely blinked. But here's this wasn't just another near miss in a long history of military posturing. This was a strategic blunder of the highest order, one that reveals just how dangerously misaligned Venezuela's calculations are, how brittle America's deterrence has become, and how quickly a single misstep in the Caribbean could spiral into something far worse. I've spent the last 3 decades studying crisis escalation, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the South China Sea standoffs, and let me tell you, this is the kind of incident that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. And right now, no one in Washington or Caracas seems to fully grasp the gravity of what just happened. The official what they want you to believe. If you've been following the news, here's the version you've probably. The US was conducting standard surveillance near Venezuela's exclusive economic zone, a routine part of its hemispheric security operations. The Venezuelan Su-30, acting on orders from Maduro's government, performed an aggressive intercept, locking its radar onto the P-8, a move that, in military terms, is the equivalent of pointing a loaded gun at someone's head. The US responded with a formal protest, calling the incident provocative and destabilizing. Venezuela, in turn, accused the US of violating its sovereignty and claimed the P-8 was gathering intelligence for a future aggression. The Pentagon's statement was measured: almost the US will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. The State Department added that the incident was part of a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior by the Maduro regime. Meanwhile, the media, what little of it covered the story, framed it as just another flare-up in the long, slow-burning crisis between Washington and Caracas. A blip. A nothing burger. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the US wasn't just conducting surveillance. The Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group had been deployed to the Caribbean in response to a very specific set of Venezuela, in coordination with Russia and Iran, was preparing to move advanced anti-ship missiles into the region. We're talking about systems like the Russian Bastion P, which can sink a carrier from 300 miles away, or the Iranian Ghadar, which is designed to evade US radar. This wasn't just a routine patrol, it was a deterrence mission, and Venezuela knew it. Second, the Su-30's radar lock wasn't some rogue pilot's mistake. That jet was scrambled from an airbase that, according to declassified intelligence, has been receiving direct support from the Wagner Group. Yes, that Wagner Group, the same mercenaries who've been propping up Maduro's regime with everything from cyber warfare to gold smuggling. The order to lock onto that P-8 didn't come from some mid-level officer. It came from the top. And that tells us Maduro isn't just posturing. He's testing the US response threshold. Third, and most importantly, this wasn't just about Venezuela. The Harry S. Truman wasn't in the Caribbean by accident. It was there because the US has been watching very closely as Russia and China have been making inroads in America's traditional backyard. Moscow has been shipping arms to Caracas, Beijing has been buying up Venezuelan oil at cut-rate prices to bypass sanctions, and both have been using the country as a staging ground for intelligence operations against the US. This incident wasn't just a Venezuelan provocation. It was a proxy provocation, with Moscow and Beijing watching intently to see how Washington would react. So no, this wasn't just another routine intercept. This was a calculated escalation, one that Venezuela, Russia, and China all had a stake in. And the US response? So far, it's been dangerously predictable. The hidden what's really going on. Let's start with the facts that the official narrative conveniently omits. Fact number 1, Venezuela's military is a hollow shell, but it's being propped up by Russia and Iran. Maduro's armed forces are a shadow of what they were in the 1990s. Years of corruption, sanctions, and brain drain have left the Venezuelan military a shell of its former self. The Su-30 that locked onto that P-8? It's one of the last operational jets in their fleet. The Navy? Most of its ships are rusting in port. The Army? Starved of resources, demoralized, and increasingly reliant on paramilitary groups to maintain control. By all rights, Venezuela's military should be a non-factor in regional security. But here's it's not operating alone. Russia and Iran have been systematically rebuilding Venezuela's military capabilities not because they care about Maduro, but because they see Venezuela as a strategic foothold in America's backyard. Moscow has been sending advisors, spare parts, and even Wagner Group mercenaries to keep the regime's war machine running. Iran has been supplying drones, missiles, and cyber warfare tools. And both have been using Venezuela as a testing ground for new tactics like the radar lock on that P-8, which was almost certainly a rehearsal for something bigger. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about Russia and Iran signaling to the US that they can project power right up to America's doorstep. And so far, Washington hasn't given them a reason to stop. Fact number 2, the US is playing a dangerous game of deterrence, and it's not working. The Harry S. Truman wasn't just on a routine patrol. It was there to send a don't even think about deploying those anti-ship missiles. But here's the deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to act. And right now, Maduro, Putin, and the Ayatollahs in Tehran have every reason to doubt that. Think about it. The US has spent the last decade drawing red lines only to back down when they're crossed. Syria, Ukraine, Taiwan. Each time, Washington has responded with sanctions, condemnations, and half measures, but never with the kind of overwhelming force that would make an adversary think twice. And now, in Venezuela, we're seeing the same pattern. The US deploys a carrier, issues a stern statement, and nothing. No kinetic response. No escalation. Just business as usual. That's a problem. Because when you deploy a carrier strike group, you're not just flexing muscle, you're making a promise. And if you don't follow through, your adversaries start testing you. That's exactly what Maduro did with that Su-30. And if the US doesn't respond decisively, he'll do it again. And next time, it might not be a radar lock. It might be a missile. Fact number 3, this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the new Cold War. Let's be Venezuela is a pawn in a much larger game. Russia and China aren't propping up Maduro out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they see Latin America as the next front in their campaign to erode US influence. Moscow has been using Venezuela as a launchpad for hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and even sabotage operations against US allies in the region. Beijing, meanwhile, has been buying up Venezuelan oil at discounted rates, using it to circumvent sanctions and fund its own military action. And both have been watching closely to see how the US responds to provocations like the Su-30 incident. Here's the US is still thinking in terms of the old Cold War playbook. Back then, deterrence was about nuclear weapons and massive retaliation. But today's conflicts are different. They're fought in the gray zone: cyber warfare, economic coercion, proxy forces, and deniable attacks. And right now, the US is losing. The Su-30 incident wasn't just a Venezuelan provocation. It was a test. A probe. And if the US doesn't respond in a way that makes Moscow and Beijing reconsider their strategy, they'll keep pushing. Next time, it might not be a radar lock. It might be a cyber attack on a US power grid. Or a drone strike on a US base in Colombia. Or a missile test in the Caribbean. And by then, it'll be too late. The US is about to make it worse. So what happens next? If history is any guide, the US will respond in the worst possible with more of the same. More sanctions. More condemnations. More carrier deployments that don't actually change the calculus on the ground. And in the meantime, Maduro, Putin, and the Ayatollahs will keep pushing, testing, probing, because they know that Washington's bark is worse than its bite. Here's what should the US needs to respond in a way that makes Venezuela, Russia, and Iran regret their actions. Not with a full-scale invasion, that would be a disaster. But with a calibrated, asymmetric response that imposes real costs. First, the US should make it clear that any further provocations will result in the immediate seizure of Venezuelan assets abroad: oil shipments, bank accounts, anything that keeps Maduro's regime afloat. Second, it should work with allies to impose a naval blockade on Venezuelan ports, cutting off the flow of Russian and Iranian weapons. And third, it should make it known that any attack on US forces, even a mistake, will be met with a disproportionate response. But here's the: none of that will happen. Because Washington is too divided, too risk-averse, and too focused on short-term politics to take the kind of decisive action that's needed. And that's exactly why this crisis is about to get worse. Because when you show weakness to a predator, it doesn't back down. It attacks. And right now, Venezuela, Russia, and Iran are circling. And the US is about to hand them the opening they've been waiting for.